March 15, 1946, Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. The gates were finally open. The war was over, and 24-year-old Ingrid Hoffman was free to leave, but she was not moving. She stood frozen, her small bag clutched against her chest, tears streaming down her face. She was not crying from happiness. She was crying because she did not want to go. American guards watched in confusion. Most prisoners ran toward freedom. But these German women, they were doing the opposite. They were begging to stay. They were writing letters. They were pleading with anyone who would listen. They were gripping the fence like it was the only safe place left on earth, because maybe it was. Outside that fence, across the ocean, their cities were rubble, their families were gone, their homes were ash. Inside the camp they had food, safety, and dignity. They had something Germany could no longer offer, a future. These women had been taught that America was the enemy. They had been told Americans were monsters. But behind the barbed wire, they discovered a terrifying truth. Everything they believed was a lie. If you love untold stories that textbooks forgot, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a like, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and stay until the end, because the final moment will leave you speechless. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Most people have never heard of them. When we think of German prisoners of war, we imagine soldiers, men in grey uniforms, men with rifles and helmets, men captured on battlefields across Europe. But there was another group, a group history has mostly forgotten. German women, they were called the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen. In English, this means armed forces helpers. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They did not carry guns into battle. They did not fight in trenches, but they wore uniforms. They served the Nazi war machine. And when the war ended, they became prisoners just like the men. By the spring of 1945, over 500,000 German women had served in some military capacity. Some worked as nurses near the front lines, others operated telephone switchboards, some decoded messages, others tracked enemy aircraft using radar equipment. A smaller number worked directly with anti-aircraft batteries, helping aim the guns that shot at Allied bombers. They were young. Most were between 18 and 30 years old. Many had joined because they believed in Germany. Others joined because they had no choice. Ingrid Hoffman was one of them. She had grown up in a small town near Frankfurt. Her father was a schoolteacher. Her mother worked in a bakery. When Ingrid turned 19 in the winter of 1943, she received a letter. It was not a request. It was an order. She was to report for duty as a signals operator with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. She had never wanted to join anything, but in Hitler's Germany, wanting did not matter. She later wrote in her diary, "I remember the day I left home. My mother stood at the door. She did not cry. She was too afraid to cry. I carried one small bag. I did not know where I was going. I did not know when I would return. I did not know if I would return at all." For 2 years, Ingrid worked at a communication center in Belgium. She relayed messages between units. She listened to static for hours. She slept in cold barracks and ate watery soup. And then in January 1945, the Americans came. Her unit was captured near the city of Liège. She expected to be shot. That is what the propaganda had told her. Americans were monsters. Americans killed prisoners. Americans showed no mercy. Instead, a young American officer handed her a blanket and a cup of coffee. The coffee was hot. The blanket was warm. And for the first time in months, Ingrid felt something strange. She felt safe. The US military did not know what to do with the German women they captured. There were no rules for this. The Geneva Convention covered male prisoners of war. But women, this was new. This was unexpected. At first, the women were held in temporary camps in France and Belgium. Conditions were harsh. Food was limited. Space was tight. But the Americans quickly realized they needed a better solution. So they made a decision. They would send the women across the ocean. They would send them to America. Camp Gruber near the town of Muskogee in Oklahoma had been built in 1942. It was originally a training camp for American soldiers. Thousands of young men had passed through its wooden barracks before shipping out to Europe or the Pacific. But by 1944, the camp had a new purpose. It became a prisoner of war camp. First for German men, then starting in early 1945 for German women. The journey across the Atlantic took nearly 3 weeks. The women traveled on a converted cargo ship. The sleeping quarters were cramped. The air below deck smelled of salt and sweat and engine oil. Many of the women were seasick. Others were simply terrified. They had no idea what waited for them in America. They had only their fears and the lies they had been told. When the ship finally docked in New York, the women were loaded onto trains. The journey to Oklahoma took 3 more days. They stared out the windows at a country they did not recognize. Green fields, clean towns, cars on every road, children playing in yards. There were no bomb craters. There were no ruined buildings. There was no hunger visible anywhere. One woman, a nurse named Elsa Weber, later recalled the moment they arrived at Camp Gruber. The train stopped. We stepped onto the platform, and I looked around and thought, this cannot be real. The sky was so big. The land was so flat. Everything was so quiet. I had expected a prison. I had expected chains and guards with whips. Instead, I saw wooden buildings and a fence and grass. Just grass stretching forever. By April 1945, over 150 German women were housed at Camp Gruber. They lived in separate barracks from the men. They had their own mess hall, their own routines, their own world within a world. And slowly, day by day, something began to change inside them. Something none of them had expected. But this was only the beginning. What happened next would challenge everything they believed. The first morning at Camp Gruber, Ingrid Hoffmann woke to a sound she did not recognize. Silence. No sirens, no explosions, no shouting officers, just silence. And then, somewhere in the distance, a bird singing. She lay in her bunk for several minutes, staring at the wooden ceiling, wondering if she was dreaming. Then came the smell. Bacon, real bacon, frying somewhere nearby. The scent drifted through the barracks like a ghost from another life. In Germany, she had not eaten bacon in over 2 years. Meat of any kind had become a luxury. But here, on her first morning as a prisoner in America, the air smelled like breakfast. The mess hall was a simple wooden building with long tables and benches. The women lined up with metal trays. They expected thin soup. They expected stale bread. They expected the same hunger they had known for years. Instead, they received eggs, toast with butter, bacon strips, coffee with real sugar, and orange juice, something many of them had never tasted before. Else Weber remembered that first breakfast clearly. She wrote about it years later. I stared at my tray. I did not move. The woman next to me asked if I was feeling sick. I told her no. I told her I was trying to understand. In Germany, we were free, and we were starving. Here, we were prisoners, and we were being fed like queens. Nothing made sense anymore. This was the paradox that would define their time in Oklahoma. Everything they had been taught about America was wrong. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, uncivilized, and cruel. They had been told that American soldiers tortured prisoners, that American prisons were death camps, that surrender meant suffering beyond imagination. But the reality was something else entirely. The reality was 3 meals a day. The reality was clean water and warm showers. The reality was medical care when they were sick. The reality was guards who did not beat them, did not scream at them, did not treat them like animals. Camp Gruber operated under strict rules, but those rules were fair. The women woke at 6 each morning. They did chores around the camp. They worked in the kitchen, the laundry, the small garden where vegetables were grown. They earned 80 cents per day for their labor. The money could be spent at a small canteen that sold cigarettes, soap, candy, and writing paper. The camp commander was a man named Colonel Howard S. Patterson. He was in his mid-50s. With grey hair and tired eyes, he had served in the First World War. He had seen enough death to fill several lifetimes. When the women first arrived, he gathered his staff and gave them clear instructions. "These are prisoners," he said, "but they are also human beings. Treat them accordingly. No cruelty, no abuse, no exceptions." Not everyone agreed with this approach. Some of the guards had lost friends in the war. Some had lost brothers. They did not understand why they should show kindness to the enemy, but Colonel Patterson was firm. He believed that treating prisoners with dignity was not weakness. It was strength. It was what separated America from the nations it had fought against. By the summer of 1945, the camp had established a school. Classes were held 3 times a week in a large barracks that had been converted into a classroom. A German-American teacher named Mrs. Gertrude Reinhardt taught English, American history, and basic mathematics. She had fled Germany in 1936, escaping the rising tide of Nazi persecution. Now she stood before women who had served that very regime, and she taught them with patience instead of anger. The women were suspicious at first. They thought it was a trick. They thought the lessons were propaganda designed to brainwash them. But Mrs. Reinhardt did not preach. She did not lecture about politics. She simply taught. She showed them newspapers from across America. She explained how democracy worked. She answered their questions honestly, even when those questions were difficult. Ingrid attended every class. She had always loved learning. In another life, she might have gone to university, but the war had stolen that future. Now, in a prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma, she found something she had lost: hope. She discovered American authors like Ernest Hemingway and John Steinbeck. She read about the American Revolution. She learned words in English that had no direct translation in German. Words like freedom and opportunity meant something different here, something larger. The camp also had a small library with over 400 books in both German and English. There was a recreation area where the women could play volleyball or simply sit in the shade. On Sunday mornings, a local priest came to hold Catholic Mass. Protestant services were held in the afternoons. The women were allowed to practice their faith without interference. By autumn, something remarkable had happened. The women stopped thinking of Camp Gruber as a prison. It did not feel like captivity. It felt like shelter. The fence that surrounded them was not keeping them in. It was keeping the war out. Inside those wooden walls, they had found peace. Outside, the world was still burning. But peace never lasts forever. Soon, letters began to arrive from Germany, and with those letters came news that would change everything. The mail arrived on Thursdays. Every week, the women gathered near the administration building, waiting for their names to be called. Some stood quietly. Others fidgeted with nervous hands. A few pretended they did not care. But everyone waited. Everyone hoped. A letter from home meant someone was still alive. It meant the world they left behind still existed in some form. But by the autumn of 1945, the letters that arrived carried a different kind of news. The news was not good. The news was devastating. Ingrid Hoffmann received her first letter in September. It came from a cousin she had not seen in 3 years. The letter was short, only 1 page, but that single page destroyed the last image she held of home. Her parents' house was gone. A bombing raid in March had flattened the entire street. Her father had died in the blast. Her mother had survived but was now living in a refugee shelter near Kassel. The bakery where her mother once worked no longer existed. The school where her father once taught was rubble. Ingrid read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, walked outside, and sat on the ground behind her barracks. She did not cry. She could not cry. The tears simply would not come. Instead, she felt hollow, empty, like someone had reached inside her chest and removed something important. She was not alone in her grief. Throughout Camp Gruber, similar scenes played out week after week. Women received news of dead husbands, dead parents, dead siblings, missing children, cities erased from maps, entire neighborhoods turned to ash. The Germany they remembered was gone. What remained was a broken country divided into 4 zones, occupied by foreign armies, starving and desperate. Else Weber received word that her hometown of Dresden had been destroyed in February 1945. Over 25,000 people had died in a single night of bombing. Her sister was among them. Her sister had been 22 years old. She had worked as a seamstress. She had never worn a uniform. She had never supported the war, but she had died anyway, buried under burning rubble while fire consumed the city. Else later wrote, "When I read that letter, I understood something terrible. The Germany I wanted to return to did not exist anymore. It was not waiting for me. It was not anywhere. It had been burned away, and I was supposed to go back to this place? To do what? To stand in the ashes and weep?" The women began to talk differently after the letters arrived. Before, they had spoken about going home. They had made plans. They had counted the days. But now those conversations stopped. Instead, they asked different questions. What was left? Who was left? Where would they even go? The American guards noticed the change. The women who had once seemed eager for freedom now seemed afraid of it. They worked harder in the kitchen and the laundry. They attended more classes. They spent longer hours in the library. They did everything they could to stay busy, keep their minds away from the darkness waiting across the ocean. One guard, a young corporal named Samuel Brooks, spoke about it years later in an interview. "I didn't understand at first," he said. "These women were prisoners. The war was over. They should have been happy, but they weren't. They looked scared. And then I started hearing what was in those letters. Whole families gone, whole cities gone. And I realized something. For them, freedom meant going back to nothing. Prison meant safety. It was backwards. It made no sense, but it was true." By November 1945, the mood in Camp Gruber had shifted completely. The women no longer spoke about home as a destination. They spoke about it as a memory, something that once existed but no longer did. The future they had imagined was replaced by fear and uncertainty. Ingrid wrote in her diary during this period, "I think about Oklahoma all the time now, the sky, the quiet, the food, the kindness. I think about what it would mean to stay here, to never go back. Is that betrayal? Am I betraying my mother by wanting this? She is alone in a shelter, eating scraps, sleeping on a cot. And I am here, eating bacon, reading books, feeling safe. I feel guilty, but I also feel something else. I feel like this is where I belong, and that thought terrifies me more than anything." The paradox had become unbearable. These women were prisoners who felt free. They were captives who felt cared for. And now they faced a choice no one had prepared them for. Return to a homeland that was destroyed, or fight to stay in a country that had once been their enemy. But the choice was not really theirs to make. The Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners of war had to be sent back once the war ended. The rules did not ask what the prisoners wanted. The rules did not care about destroyed cities or dead families. The rules simply demanded repatriation. And so the orders came, papers were signed, dates were set. The women of Camp Gruber would be sent home whether they wanted to go or not. But some of them were not ready to accept that fate. Some of them decided to fight back. The announcement came on a cold morning in December 1945. A military officer stood before the women in the mess hall and read from an official document. All German prisoners of war would be repatriated by the end of spring 1946. Ships were being prepared. Schedules were being made. The women would return to Germany in groups over the coming months. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The officer folded his paper, nodded once and walked out. Behind him he left 150 women staring at empty plates, their minds racing with the same terrible thought. They were being sent back to the ashes, back to the hunger, back to a country that no longer felt like home. That evening a small group gathered behind the laundry barracks. There were 7 women. Ingrid Hoffmann was among them. So was Else Weber. So was a young woman named Liesel Braun, who had worked as a radio operator before her capture. They spoke in whispers, even though no one was listening. Old habits from the war still controlled their voices. Liesel spoke first. "We do not have to accept this. We can write letters. We can petition the authorities. The Americans have laws. They have courts. Maybe there is a way." Else shook her head. "The Geneva Convention is clear. They have to send us back. It is international law. But the war is over," Liesel said. "We are not dangerous. We are not soldiers anymore. Why should old laws decide our futures?" Ingrid stayed quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. "My mother is in Germany. She is alone. Part of me feels I should go back to her. But another part of me knows the truth. If I go back, I will die there. Maybe not right away, but slowly. From hunger, from cold, from hopelessness. Here, I have a chance. Here, I might actually live." The group made a decision that night. They would fight, not with weapons, not with violence, but with words. They would write letters to anyone who might listen. They would appeal to churches, to newspapers, to politicians. They would explain their situation and ask for mercy. Over the following weeks, the women wrote dozens of letters. Their English was imperfect, but their meaning was clear. They described the destruction waiting for them in Germany. They explained that many had no families left. They asked if there was any legal way to remain in America, even temporarily. They promised to work. They promised to contribute. They promised to become good citizens if given the chance. The letters went to congressmen in Washington. They went to the Red Cross. They went to local churches in Oklahoma. They went to newspapers in Muskogee and Tulsa. The women did not know if anyone would read them. They did not know if anyone would care. But they wrote anyway. Writing was the only weapon they had left. To their surprise, some people did care. A Methodist church in Muskogee responded first. The pastor, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, visited Camp Gruber in January 1946. He met with several of the women, including Ingrid. He listened to their stories. He looked at the photographs they showed him of destroyed cities and lost families, and when he left, he made a promise. He would speak on their behalf. Reverend Whitfield wrote letters of his own. He contacted other religious leaders. He spoke to local politicians. He gave a sermon about the women at Camp Gruber, describing them not as enemies, but as victims of a war that had taken everything from them. His congregation was moved. Some members volunteered to sponsor the women if they were allowed to stay. Others donated money to support the cause. Local newspapers picked up the story. A reporter from the Tulsa Tribune visited the camp and interviewed several women. The article appeared on the front page under the headline, "German Women Prisoners Fear Return to Ruins." It described their living conditions, their education, their hopes and fears. It humanized them in a way that surprised many readers. But the military was unmoved. The rules were the rules. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. Sponsorship offers and newspaper articles could not change international law. A military spokesman told the Tribune, "We sympathize with their situation, but our hands are tied. These women are prisoners of war. They must be returned to their country of origin." Ingrid heard the news on a grey afternoon in February. The petition had failed. The appeals had been rejected. Repatriation would proceed as scheduled. She sat on her bunk and stared at the wall for a long time. She thought about the letters she had written. She thought about Reverend Whitfield and his kindness. She thought about the church members who had offered to sponsor her. All of it had been for nothing. That night, she wrote a final entry in her diary. "I have tried everything. I have begged. I have pleaded. I have explained. But the answer is always the same. No. They say it is the law. They say their hands are tied. But I wonder, is the law more important than a human life? Is a piece of paper more important than a future? I do not have the answer. I only know that tomorrow I will start packing, and soon I will leave the only place where I have ever felt safe. The gates would soon open. But for these women, freedom felt like a sentence." The trucks arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 1946. They were painted olive green, the same color as everything the American military owned. The women had been told to pack the night before. They were allowed one small bag each, nothing more. Most of them had very little anyway. A few clothes, some letters, a book or two from the library they had been allowed to keep. Small treasures from a life that was about to end. Ingrid Hoffman stood near the barracks door, watching the other women file out. Some walked quickly, heads down, eager to get the goodbye over with. Others moved slowly, looking around at the camp as if trying to memorize every detail. The wooden buildings, the dirt paths, the fence that had once felt like a cage, but now felt like protection. The sky, so wide and blue, stretching forever in every direction. She thought about how strange this moment was. Prisoners were supposed to celebrate their release. They were supposed to run toward freedom with joy in their hearts. But these women were not running. They were dragging their feet. They were wiping tears from their eyes. They were leaving safety and walking toward uncertainty. Else Weber was in the first group to depart. She and Ingrid had become close friends during their months at Camp Gruber. They had shared meals together. They had studied English together. They had whispered late at night about their fears and hopes. Now they stood facing each other, knowing they might never meet again. Elsie reached out and took Ingrid's hands. Her grip was tight. Her eyes were wet. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you will find your way back here someday. Promise me this is not the end." Ingrid wanted to promise. She wanted to believe that the future held something good, but the words stuck in her throat. She could not lie to her friend. She did not know what waited for her in Germany. She did not know if she would survive the next year. She did not know anything at all. Instead, she hugged Elsa and whispered, "I will try. That is all I can promise. I will try." The guards helped the women onto the trucks. The engines started. The vehicles rolled toward the main gate. Ingrid watched from the side of the road as the convoy passed through the fence and disappeared down the long dirt road that led away from Camp Gruber. Dust rose behind the trucks and hung in the air like smoke. She would not see Elsa Weber again for 11 years. Ingrid's turn came 2 weeks later. Her group was the last to leave. By then, the camp felt empty. The barracks that had once been full of voices were silent. The mess hall served meals to only a handful of women. The classroom where Mrs. Reinhardt had taught English was locked and dark. Everything that had made Camp Gruber feel alive was gone. On her final night, Ingrid walked to the fence one last time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The prairie grass bent gently in the evening wind. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled. She stood there for nearly an hour, her fingers wrapped around the wire, her heart heavy with a sadness she could not fully explain. Colonel Patterson found her there. He had come to say goodbye. He was not required to do this. He was not required to care about the prisoners in his charge. But he had watched these women for over a year. He had seen them arrive frightened and broken. He had seen them heal. He had seen them learn and grow and become something new. And now he had to send them back to a nightmare. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I wish there was more I could do." Ingrid did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "You did enough, Colonel. You treated us like human beings. That is more than we ever expected." Patterson nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I hope you find peace over there. I hope you find your family. I hope Germany rebuilds." Ingrid finally turned to face him. Her eyes were dry. She had no more tears left. "And if it does not rebuild, if there is nothing left to find?" The colonel had no answer. He had seen enough war to know that some wounds never heal. Some losses cannot be replaced. Some homes can never be rebuilt. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezed gently, and walked away. The next morning, Ingrid boarded the truck with the final group of women. She sat near the back, pressed against the canvas wall, watching Camp Gruber shrink in the distance. The barracks grew smaller. The fence became a thin line. The water tower vanished behind a ridge. And then it was gone. All of it. Gone. The journey back to Germany took almost a month, first by truck to the train station, then by train across America to the East Coast, then by ship across the Atlantic. The ship was crowded and uncomfortable. The food was plain. The sleeping quarters were cramped. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the destination. What mattered was what waited at the end. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven, Ingrid stepped onto German soil for the first time in nearly 2 years. The port was destroyed. Cranes lay twisted in the water. Buildings stood hollow and burned. The air smelled of salt and smoke and decay. She looked around and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no sense of homecoming, only emptiness. She was free. But freedom had never... No family, no future, no reason to stay. She would go back to America. She would find a way. The process took years. Immigration laws were strict. Quotas limited how many Germans could enter the United States. Paperwork had to be filed, reviewed, rejected, and filed again. Ingrid worked as a translator for the American occupation forces, saving every penny she could. She studied English until she could speak it without hesitation. She gathered letters of recommendation from anyone who would write them. In 1952, her application was finally approved. She sailed to New York on a passenger ship called the SS United States. The crossing took 5 days. When she saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor, she stood on the deck and cried, not from sadness, from relief, from joy, from the feeling that her life was finally beginning again. She settled in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was less than 50 miles from Camp Gruber. She got a job as a secretary at an oil company. She rented a small apartment. She made friends. She joined a church. She built a life, piece by piece, day by day. And every year on the anniversary of her departure from Camp Gruber, she drove out to where the camp had once stood. The barracks were gone. The fence had been torn down. The buildings had been dismantled and hauled away. Only the land remained, flat and quiet, covered in grass and wildflowers. She would park her car and walk to the spot where she thought her barracks had been. She would stand there in silence, remembering the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Ingrid was not alone in her return. Of the 150 women who had passed through Camp Gruber, at least 40 eventually immigrated to the United States. Some came in the late 1940s. Others came in the 1950s and 1960s. They settled in cities across America. They became nurses, teachers, secretaries, factory workers, mothers, and grandmothers. They built quiet lives far from the war that had shaped them. Else Weber was among them. She arrived in 1957 and settled in Chicago. She and Ingrid reconnected through letters, then phone calls, then visits. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. When they met, they sometimes spoke about Camp Gruber, about the food, about the kindness, about the strange, painful summer when they had been prisoners who did not want to be free. Ingrid Hoffman died in Tulsa in 2001. She was 80 years old. Her funeral was attended by 2 generations of family and dozens of friends who knew her as a kind woman with a gentle accent and a careful way of speaking. Few of them knew the full story of her past. Few of them understood what she had survived. After the service, her granddaughter found a photograph tucked into an old Bible. The picture showed a wooden fence stretching across an empty prairie. On the back, in faded ink, were 4 words written in Ingrid's careful handwriting. "Where I found home." Sometimes home is not where you are born. Sometimes it is where you are safe. Sometimes it is where you are finally seen. And sometimes it is simply where you are allowed to become who you were always meant to be. The story of the German women at Camp Gruber is not found in most history books. It does not fit neatly into narratives of victory and decay. She looked around and felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no sense of homecoming, only emptiness. She was free. But freedom had never felt so heavy. Ingrid Hoffmann spent her first weeks in Germany searching. She traveled by foot, by crowded train, by any means she could find. The country around her was broken. Roads were cracked and filled with rubble. Bridges had collapsed into rivers. Towns that had once been full of life were now empty shells, their windows dark, their streets silent. She found her mother in a refugee camp near Kassel. The camp was a collection of wooden shacks built on muddy ground. Hundreds of people lived there, packed together like animals. The food was thin soup and hard bread. The water came from a single pump that sometimes worked and sometimes did not. Disease spread easily. Hope did not spread at all. Her mother did not recognize her at first. The woman Ingrid remembered had been strong and proud, with bright eyes and steady hands. The woman in front of her now was thin and pale, her hair grey, her face lined with exhaustion. When Ingrid spoke her name, her mother stared for a long moment, then began to weep. They held each other in the mud, 2 survivors of a war that had taken everything from them. Around them, other families did the same. Reunions happened every day in the camp, but so did funerals, so did hunger, so did despair. Ingrid stayed with her mother for the next year. She worked whatever jobs she could find. She cleared rubble from bombed buildings. She washed clothes for American soldiers stationed nearby. She traded ration cards for medicine when her mother fell ill. Every day was a struggle. Every night was cold. Every morning she woke up wondering if this was all life would ever be. But she never stopped thinking about Oklahoma. She thought about the wide sky. She thought about the quiet prairie. She thought about the meals that had filled her stomach and the classes that had filled her mind. She thought about the fence she had gripped on her last night, watching the sunset.